We're in the midst of wrapping up another presidential election, but if you thought this meant the end of the political rhetoric, you are easily mistaken. As is typical in the post-election day period, political parties passionately reiterate their stances and arguments for why they should be in the White House. They continue to make a bid to change the hearts and minds of the people. But why? If the election is over, then the winner should be determined. Persuasion should no longer play a part in a contest that is already decided. Well, here's the thing. The winner of the election is not necessarily determined on election day. What? You say? How can that be? It's called election day, the day when the next president is elected. Well, ideally that would be the case. At the very least, the next president should existentially be decided, with the declaration of the winner awaiting only the count of our immutable votes. However, we utilize a system that is, well, a little convoluted. It is subject to some justified scrutiny. The votes are still being counted, the counted votes are contested, and people feel like they aren't being represented. Until everything is cleared up, people will voice their dissatisfaction with our system. We should have won. They cheated. Our opponents are terrible people who don't deserve it. Or they may even say, democracy has failed. Is our system so bad that democracy itself has failed? I want to address the system that is on the derisive tongue of all of the cynics and at the forefront of all of our minds, the Electoral College. In 1787, prominent statesmen of the time got together to figure out how this whole American government thing would work. Hamilton, Washington, Madison, you know the lot. Well, one of the predicaments they were tackling was how to elect a president of the United States. They thought, let's just have Congress elect someone. Nah, that's no good. Gives too much power to the legislative branch. All right, fine. Just have the state legislatures elect someone instead. Still too much power to the legislative branch. Why don't we just let the people vote? Oh, I'm sure you'd like that, Pennsylvania. You have more than double the amount of people my state has. Why don't we just let your state decide the president? I mean, sure, why not? No! After some considered deliberation, they worked something out. They based their system on something they had seen in classical Rome once. They would give each state a set amount of representation by default, and then additional representation according to a state's population. To be more nuanced, each state got an elector for every senator they had, always two, and an elector for every representative they had, which was based on population. The electors themselves would then vote, with the majority deciding the presidency. With this elector system, small states would always get at least some representation, and larger states would get the representation due to them. Everyone agreed to this compromise, and it worked perfectly till the end of time, and they all lived happily ever after. If only. It turns out that they left the discussion of the presidential election till the end of the Constitutional Convention. They were tired, everyone just wanted to go home. They just didn't put their whole heart into it. They allowed a bit of latitude in the process. They weren't quite confident that they had made the perfect system, but figured they'd fix it in post. But the selection of the electors would prove more troublesome than they realized. Voting for electors was originally supposed to be like voting for any other elected official. People would vote for them, and the electors, judged honorable by the people, were expected to serve their position in a fair and considered way. They were free agents with the privilege given by the people to vote on their behalf. Well, that pretense didn't last all too long, as the country that prided itself on being free from the influence of political parties developed political parties. Electors who were supposed to be independent became bound to the will of their parties, and so did their vote. No longer could the people expect them to make the best decision, only to make their party's decision. Well, a trifling matter, a problem averted easily enough, electors openly declared and pledged themselves to certain candidates. It was simply a matter of voting for the elector pledged the candidate one favored. No more beating around the bush. The voter was no longer voting for character, they were voting for the actual candidate they preferred, middleman notwithstanding. The system has been so accustomed to this idea that many states don't even bother mentioning the elector you're voting for anymore. You merely mark your choice for president, and your vote for the corresponding elector is assumed. There was a much bigger issue that arose, though. The framers of the Constitution did not specify exactly how each state would decide their electors. This is demonstrated by the fact that many different states use several different methods of choosing their electors in the early presidential elections. Sometimes the legislature picked the electors, sometimes the people did, sometimes they even used one method, changed it the next election, and then reverted to the original again. No method was set in stone, and it is still subject to change in any state to this day. Well, Robo, you say, we must use the people voting method. I know we do, because I voted in this last election. And to that I say, we do and we don't. You see, there are different people voting methods. There's the district method. Individual state districts vote for their respective district elector. Or the statewide method, also known as the winner-take-all method. In this method, the popular vote earns all of a state's electors, also known as a slate of electors. Now, you've probably heard the term winner-take-all before, and you've probably heard that the Electoral College is a dubious system. Well, let me make it clear. The winner-take-all paradigm is what makes the Electoral College a dubious system. As I implied before, the winner-take-all method was always an option for states ever since the system's inception, but it wasn't until 1824 that it became the standard. That was the year of a particularly contentious election with 4 different candidates vying for the presidency. If the electoral votes were divided among individual districts, they would have been too diluted to guarantee anyone a victory. Most of the states decided to make a power play and chose the winner-take-all method. That way, they could put all of their votes behind a single candidate and make the best attempt at getting their guy into office. I mean, considering the win condition and the rules of the contest, it was just common sense game theory to employ this strategy. And if any of the states were using it, then the rest had to use it as well, or else be left at a disadvantage. On that election and ever since, winner-take-all has been the main method of choosing electors. And that's the problem. We evolved into the system that is gamified pretty easily. Politicians no longer have an incentive to win over the entire country with their platform, just select key areas. The country is already divided up among partisan platforms. Certain states, certain regions, many individuals will prioritize party support in a bid to reform government to their standards. It may or may not be clear to them that partisan politics cannot address all of their grievances with governance, but that is ultimately an irrelevant point. We have to play the game according to its parameters, and unfortunately, it means picking one of a couple candidates. So these regions will decide what platform fits them, and then they're kind of obligated to support it. It sounds like I am being patronizing in explaining something so apparent, but I am merely trying to emphasize my actual point. The problem is not the parties alone, but that entire states are bound to parties. That is why we hear elections framed so chiefly in terms of states. Campaigns strategize on winning states, the news media reports on the position of states, people concern themselves with who wins their state. Election strategy revolves around the high value weight of the states. However, Every election hinges on the choice of only several states. Only several states will make the winning difference in electoral votes. Other states are of less import. Either they are already loyal to a given party, making campaign efforts there unnecessary, or they are hostile to a given party, making efforts there futile. Only certain states matter, and they matter a lot. Using less prudent methods to win them would become a tempting consideration, especially since the payoff is so great for the requisite effort. By winning an individual state, a campaign doesn't merely win a single vote, but a number of electoral votes. A campaign wouldn't need to generate an entire state's worth of public votes, only enough to achieve a majority. Let's say a campaign only needs 1,000 more votes for a majority. The campaign could theoretically generate this relatively low number, and for its efforts, attain all of that state's electoral votes. Those electoral votes would presumably make up the difference in the electoral majority, resulting in the presidency. If the system is susceptible to corruption at any level, it would surely be at this stage of the process. And every election, we hear claims of such phenomena taking place. The voting machines have been hijacked, people voted multiple times, a party is buying votes. Political campaigns are accused of all of these and more, mostly towards whichever side is winning. Maybe there is some credibility to these claims, and maybe these are just baseless allegations. But under the format of our current system, we have to admit the potential for fraud in any given election. Unfortunately, as long as we are using a winner-take-all elector method, the potential for election fraud will be more likely. Of course, there are more than theoretical problems with the winner-take-all method. On people voting for the electors, remember when I said we do and we don't? I wasn't being vague, I was being literal. Some people are voting, others are having their votes disregarded. In a winner-take-all state, what happens to the votes cast for an unpopular candidate? You could say that they just simply aren't considered at all. Well, what happens is actually worse than that. Once a candidate gets a majority in a state, all of that state's electoral votes go toward that candidate. Even if you didn't vote for that candidate or that candidate's elector, your actual vote will be disregarded and an elector will be elected on your behalf. A vote for an unpopular candidate in a state becomes a vote for the popular candidate in that state. Yep, you heard me right. People's votes go towards candidates they didn't vote for regularly. Well, perhaps it is more accurate to say that people are being misrepresented. A constitutional amendment actually has something to say on this subject. Allow me to paraphrase Section 2 of the 14th Amendment. It says that representatives shall be appointed among the several states according to the number of people in their state. If the right to vote is denied to eligible residents, then that state's representation shall be reduced by a proportional amount. That effectively means that your residence in a state as a legal voter partly qualifies your state for an electoral vote. Assuming you are a legal voter, that electoral vote is supposed to represent you and your community. If you are not being represented, then your state's electoral votes may be reduced. So whichever way the electoral vote goes, either for your candidate or against them, it is rhetorically on your behalf. And if someone is voting on your behalf but not reflecting your vote, then it would be fair to call that disenfranchisement, especially considering the scale of the issue potentially affecting half of a state's voters. Now, you may want to argue why winner-take-all is logically fair, but any way you go with it, you're going to face some contradictions. Maybe you would argue winning a majority should rightfully earn the presidency. That's an understandable argument, but it's fallacious in this example. If we are using an electoral system, then a majority of the electoral vote should earn the presidency, not a single state's majority popular vote. In fact, a winner-take-all system is more likely to elect someone who didn't win a majority national vote. As demonstrated before, This method will give electoral votes to candidates people didn't vote for. If you voted for a candidate, but that candidate was not the popular choice in your state, then your vote is not going to your candidate. If this happens enough throughout the country, then the contradictory situation arises where a candidate can win sufficient electoral votes but lose the national popular vote. Another defense for winner-take-all is that an individual state represents an individual undivided voice. Therefore, the electors should vote in unison. However, that very notion is already covered in our electoral system. If no president can achieve a majority of electoral votes, then the election goes to a contingent election. In a contingent election, electoral votes are disregarded altogether. Every state gets one vote of representation instead of the multiple votes that would be allowed normally. It is in the contingent election that states speak with a single voice and are therefore given a single vote. Contrariwise, a typical election allows states multiple votes, ostensibly representing multiple voices. If electors must all vote in unison, then they are not representing the multiple voices of their state. Again, this leads us to a conflict with the 14th Amendment. So what can be done about our current system? Can it even be fixed? Well, the district method definitely seems to be a more representative and democratic alternative to what we have now. In this method, a state is divided up among congressional districts. Voters of their respective districts then decide on their elector candidate, and that elector represents and votes for them in the election. Electors would be chosen by their own district and not by the popular vote of their state. So they would not be obligated to all vote in unison. They would cast a vote that represents their constituents. There is some important historical context to this consideration. In 1892, the U.S. Supreme Court decided on the McPherson versus Blacker case. Michigan had recently just approved the district method. However, several of the electors, including a Mr. McPherson, were unhappy with this new system. They brought a case against Mr. Blacker, the Michigan Secretary of State. Chief Justice Melville Fuller delivered a compelling judgment upholding the right of the state to change its elector method as it saw fit. He argued, if the legislature possesses plenary authority to direct the manner of appointment and might itself exercise the appointing power by joint ballot or concurrence of the two houses or according to such mode as designated, it is difficult to perceive why, if the legislature prescribes as method of appointment choice by vote, it must necessarily be by general ticket and not by districts. To break it down, he was arguing that since the legislature has the power to just directly select the electors themselves, they are under no obligation to defer to the electors' preference on the matter. If they are allowed to implement a general ticket, winner-take-all method, then they are certainly allowed to implement a district method. He also stated, the state also acts individually through its electoral college, although by reason of the power of the legislature over the manner of appointment, the vote of the electors may be divided. He was saying that states choose their electors on an individual basis, separate from the other states, but their electors don't necessarily have to all vote together. Fuller even cites the framers' preference for the district method. That's right, the creators of the Constitution themselves envisioned the district method. It's too bad they didn't actually get around to putting it in the Constitution when they had the chance. Jefferson said on the issue, all agree that an election by districts would be best if it could be general. James Madison had been considering the issue prior to the election of 1824, but openly advocated for district electors after how contentious that election turned out. To paraphrase, he said that the current method was so great a departure from the principle of equality that an amendment was justly called for. He explicitly said the district mode was mostly, if not exclusively, in view when the Constitution was framed and adopted. Although there were attempts to alter the system exclusively to the district method with an amendment, it never passed. All of this just demonstrates that the district method is not a new consideration, and it can still feasibly be implemented in our time. In fact, the U.S. never actually fully abandoned it. As of the 2020 election, Nebraska and Maine presently do employ district electors. If we did implement a nationwide district system, we would reverse many of the disadvantages that come with the winner-take-all method. Candidates couldn't just write off states as won or lost. They would have to campaign on policies that benefit the nation in general. Third parties would have a much better chance of getting some nationwide representation, as it would be much easier for them to win individual districts rather than entire states. Voters of an unpopular state candidate would retain their representation on a national level and would not be disenfranchised on a statewide scale. And finally, the incentive to target entire states for election fraud would be vastly mitigated, if not eliminated altogether. If the goal of changing the system this way is a more democratic representative system, then why not just elect the president with a national popular vote? Well, there is an attempt being made. The National Popular Vote Interstate Compact is a hypothetical policy several states are considering. They would simply agree to pledge all of their electoral votes to the winner of the national popular vote. It would effectively retrofit the popular vote onto the system we have now. Of course, it would require the greater share of the Electoral College for it to work, and not enough states accept it currently. This agreement would ameliorate potential fraud at the state level, but it would still disenfranchise unpopular candidate voters, just like the statewide method does, only on an even greater nationwide scale. And the other problem is that what would happen if a state went back on its pledge? Instead of faithless electors, we could have entire faithless states. Campaigns would try to gamify the system as well. You could be looking at a scenario in which two ideological halves of the country would vie to get that final state into their own separate compacts. Retrofitting wouldn't make the situation less complicated. It would be adding complexity. We could just use a straight popular vote, but that has a few issues to address. It would be very contentious. It would be undermining a consideration the framers built into the original system, and it would be unnecessary. In order to pass a national popular vote, we would have to nullify, or at the very least ignore, one amendment, the 12th, and Article 2, Section 1, Clause 2 of the Constitution proper. Symbolically striking a line through any phrase of the Constitution is going to be a hard sell to almost any politician. Either it would be anathema to them, or it would bear the worst publicity. It's probably the reason why the Interstate Compact doesn't attempt this route. The second issue with the straight popular vote, it removes a failsafe. The framers deliberately opted to give all states two initial representatives. This was to allow small states or new states a chance to have their voices heard. The framers were worried that they may be subject to a concept called the tyranny of the majority. With the small amount of representation, they could defend themselves on the national stage from the larger states who could potentially subvert their very livelihood via legislation. Each state has 2 senators for this reason. Each state should have at least 2 electors for the very same reason. The final issue, it's unnecessary. If the initial 2 electors afforded each state undermines due representation, then the solution to that was built into the system as well. Our old boy Madison again wrote on the subject. It may be observed also that although for a certain period the evil of state votes given by 1 or 2 individuals would be extended by the introduction of new states, it would be rapidly diminished by growing populations within extensive territories. At the present period, the evil is at its maximum. The framers granted the offset representation of the initial state electors. Why? Because they knew that population growth and subsequent elector growth would rapidly and greatly diminish their impact. The Electoral College is perpetually evolving into a more balanced system. Let's look at our actual reality. In the very first election of the country, the initial electors compose almost a third of the entire Electoral College. Any one state's initial electors composed around 6%, a decent amount, admittedly. Now, the initial electors compose less than 20% of the Electoral College, while any one state's initial electors compose less than 0.4%. Unless you are arguing that all the initial electors are voting in unison, they aren't, they belong to different states, then you can't claim that they are swaying the vote a certain way. If you are claiming that a particular state's 0.4% perk is the determining factor in any given election, then I just have to ask one question. Which way are they swinging it? Every time we get a new party in the White House, it's the initial elector representation that gets blamed for unbalancing the election. Those folks are crafty, always switching sides. Who knows what their real endgame is? No, I jest, of course. Winner-take-all contributes far more imbalance than the initial electors. California alone contributes 55 electoral votes to just one party. That's more than 10% of the entire Electoral College, and that's just one state. If you are still worried about initial electors giving too much representation to a single state, then district method can only dilute their power. The purpose of the initial state electors may be even more important today than it seems. There have been some aspirations by certain communities on the West Coast to form their own states. Details aside, they may want greater sovereignty than their current state is affording them. If greater liberty is their goal, then I believe that they have the right to form their own state. And in their newly founded status, they would be helped by the initial representation established by the framers' foresight. There are some caveats to this that go beyond the scope of this current subject. I am just demonstrating that initial representation is still an important consideration and cannot be dismissed so easily. So, assuming the district method is advantageous to the people of the U.S., how would we go about achieving it? There are two obvious routes. We could just pass an amendment to the Constitution. That would be more feasible than amending a national popular vote, because we could literally just amend legislation to the existing framework instead of nullifying anything. It would be a little blunt force, but you could just have the amendment require that all states use a district method. That would require 3/4 of the states to ratify it, though, like all amendments, which is always the hard part. Another method would be a judicial precedent. Like I said before, I contend that our system disenfranchises voters. So there's your injured party. They could form a class action lawsuit specifically addressing that their 14th Amendment has been violated. It would have to go through the courts and the appeals courts before it got to the Supreme Court. And the plaintiffs would have to win, of course. This would be easier in some ways and harder in others. Judicial precedent is not supposed to be the origin of new law, but has kind of adopted that role in modern times. Another way to pass a national district method would be to just form an interstate compact like the one mentioned previously. Only in this one, the states would all agree to use the district method. They wouldn't even need to wait for the election results. They could agree to the compact at any time before an election season. Spreading awareness and knowledge on this issue would be the first step. Civil petitions to your representatives are always recommended to get the ball rolling. But getting a nationwide district method is definitely possible, both constitutionally and realistically. We just have to put in the effort. So, is democracy still a failure, Or have we proven that it's still viable? It's not saved yet. I still have something else I want to address. Voting itself.